Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me at the back? Good. First of all, number one, thank you for coming. There's no audience, there's no talk. It becomes philosophical. We want to be action-orientated. Secondly, this is a science festival, and science is changing its notion into much more human-orientated, integrated, and interdisciplinary, and you'll get that sense from here. This is science in action, not science in contemplation. We have a wonderful panel who will be driving the notion of sustainability. So get COP26, climate change, slightly to one side of your brain, and sustainability right in the middle, and you'll be fine, because it's a very important integrating theme for what we'll be discussing over the next month in this country. We have a wonderful panel. I'm going to introduce you all, and then I'll just say before I introduce them to you that what will happen is they will speak for about 10 minutes each, one after the other, and then we will have about 20-25 minutes of commentary or questions from you. And I will ask the panel to respond to the issues you're raising at the end, and then I will summarize what I think we've got out of the afternoon. So you leave with a sense of completeness, I hope. So our wonderful panel starts with Hayley Pinto, who's over this side here. Hayley is a psychiatrist and also a doctor, and has done a tremendous amount of work on the medical public health aspects of climate change and the way in which we run our lives from a sustainable point of view. And she'll be talking about the emergence of thinking which is being driven by the medical profession around the public health aspects of sustainability and climate change. Our second presentation is Nitya Rao, who comes from this Institute for Sustainable Development, which is a link between the University of East Anglia and the Norwich Research Park. And Nitya is very, very much involved with women, gender, sustainability, nutrition, and food. And she'll be talking about that very important link between nutrition and the provision of food, which is becoming increasingly part of the work done by the new science community in the research park. Third speaker is Bryant, and he is a wonderful man in action, very interested in recycling and the regenerative economy, but also got lots of ideas of how to use interesting methods of dealing with recycled and so-called waste material and making them part of a new regenerative economy. And that's what Connor will be giving some examples on. So if you want to go home feeling good, listen to what he has to say. And then finally, very dear friend of mine, Jonathon Porritt, who I don't think needs to be introduced at all. He is the leading light, in my view, of the green movement and of anything to do with the dynamics of sustainability and environmental transition. But a great campaigner and a wonderful addition to our four speakers. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to pass on to Hayley to start the ball rolling. All the best.
Well, first of all, thank you very much all for coming today. As Tim's mentioned, am I feeding back? Don't need to get too close to that. I'm an addiction psychiatrist, and up until about a month ago, I was the head of the addiction service for Norfolk. I've recently, because of my concern and my need to put everything, all of my energies into the climate crisis, I now work for an organisation called the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare. And what we're doing is we're trying to train NHS staff and social care staff to make the NHS net zero commitment a reality. So, without further ado, we'll move forward to talk about how can we move forward positively from where we are at this point. Now, many people are quite reluctant to engage in the idea of the changes that we need to make to achieve net zero, because they're pretty comfortable with the way things are, and they kind of feel like things won't be that bad. But let's be honest, the status quo actually isn't that good for many people. Globally, 85% of the burden of health harms caused by climate change are falling on children under the age of 5. 85%. And what we're seeing is that 1 in 3 children globally, 1 in 3 of all of our children are highly exposed to 4 or more of the following stresses. So extreme heat waves, water scarcity, flooding, and vector-borne diseases like malaria. Hardly an ideal environment for them to thrive and play and develop. A recent survey of 10,000 young people from 10 different countries, including the UK, showed that 3/4 of our young people, so age 16 to 25, are really frightened of the future because of climate change. Over half of them think that humanity is doomed. Over half of them believe that the things they most value will be destroyed. And 4 out of 10 are reluctant to have children because they're worried about the future. Do you think, how have we got to the stage where our young people are so frightened of the situation that we've put them in that they want to deny themselves one of the most basic joys of human life? And in the UK, 1 in 6 children aged 5 to 16 are identified as having a mental health problem. So that's 5 children in most, the average classroom. On top of that, our current lifestyle is making us desperately unhealthy. So nearly 2/3 of adults in the UK are overweight. Only about 1/3 are actually even participating in moderate activity once a week. And nearly 1 in 10 children are leaving school with an obesity problem. And this is having an impact on our health. So we're looking at over 10,000 admissions resulted from obesity-related diseases, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, stuff like this. Air pollution. So globally, nearly 8 million people die every year as a result of air pollution already. And in the UK, probably about 40,000 per year. Now, this burden is not falling equally on everybody, although we all breathe the same air. In certain areas, the levels of pollution are higher, and these are disproportionately areas with poorer people and often black and ethnic minority communities. So one of those 40,000 deaths was this little 9-year-old girl, Ellie Deborah, who died of her asthma, aged 9. And of course, we're still suffering from the impacts of the COVID pandemic. And we know that part of the reason, so just to clarify some medical language there, 75% of all emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic. That means they jump from animal species to humans. And the conditions in which that is made more likely are due to those 7 factors listed there, of which one is climate change. And scientists estimate that there are hundreds of thousands of other viruses ready to make that jump. So if we continue to degrade our ecosystems in the way that we are at the moment, we can expect to have more pandemics, and possibly worse ones. And meanwhile, the financial and human cost of extreme weather events is increasing all the time. And again, this is not evenly borne. So the people who are suffering the most as a result of these extreme weather events are people mostly in the global south who have contributed almost nothing to the problem. So there's a huge issue in terms of climate injustice. But even in the UK, we're seeing more flooding, more storms, and some studies looking at the mental health impacts of flooding on people for many, many years afterwards, talking about the anxiety still being there every time it rains. Whole classrooms of children who can't concentrate the moment it starts to rain, and just feeling like your home isn't a safe place anymore, that it's been violated. Go on. And so we can pretty much kind of conclude that actually the status quo is not that great, that it's predicted to get worse, it will get worse, and in a country that already imports around 50% of its food, we can expect to see more food shortages even in the UK as a result of all of these aspects impacting crop yields all over the world. But it doesn't have to be like this. We hear MPs like Steve Baker talking about the things that we need to do, that we'll be cold and poor and eating insects for protein. We hear Philip Hammond talking about the fact that it's going to be far too expensive to make the changes that we need to make. But the fact is we can't afford not to. It's already costing us so much, and it will get worse. And will it be miserable? Actually, no. It will be, potentially it could be so much better We could be looking at cleaner air, clean water, fresh, healthy food, grown locally, full of nutrients, not like the plastic stuff that we're getting at the moment. Livable temperatures, nature thriving around us, and more time with our friends and family, comfortable, warm homes, healthier. So much of the suffering that we see in the health service is due to chronic diseases secondary to poor lifestyles. And these are things that these kind of changes can make better. So switching to renewable energy helps to clean up the air. Switching to active transport helps to clean up the air. It also makes us fitter. It makes us more aware of our surroundings. So instead of traveling around in a little tin box, we're actually experiencing the world around us and eating better food. These things are all designed to make not just our physical, but our mental well-being better. Imagine our cities. This is what they look like at the moment. Now, most of those vehicles that you see, those cars, they spend 95% of their time parked. So when we talk about a transition to a sustainable transport system, it makes no sense to just switch everything to electric vehicles, because you've still got all the embodied carbon, all the resource use in that car that's sitting there parked 95% of the time. And what that means is a huge amount of our cities is devoted to car transport. Imagine if we didn't, if we took those cars out, if we had a decent public transport system, people cycling around the city. It could look like, well, it could all disappear in a puff of smoke. I don't know quite what's happened there, and I'm hoping the tech guy is going to sort that out really, really quickly. But what you were going to see was a picture of cities with green roofs, green walls, people sitting in cafes, parks, community gardens, people growing their own food, coming together. And one of the things about that is that, particularly people with mental health problems, particularly people with poorer access to green spaces, benefit enormously from this. So what we know about access to green spaces is that for people who are more deprived, living in more deprived environments, there we go, that it's what we call equigenic. It starts to even out the difference in public health outcomes between people with different levels of resources. How am I doing in terms of time?
About 2 minutes.
Okay, cool. Let's zip through quickly then. So the other thing to say is that our current society has deliberately turned us into addicts of stuff, constantly wanting more, shinier, better stuff. Now, this was a deliberate ploy on the part of companies and governments to get us to buy more to boost GDP. But it doesn't make us happier. What's happened is actually over the last kind of 50 years, the levels of depression have come up and up and up. And we've got to think, how much does this stuff really mean to us? When I talk to kids in schools, when I say to them, what's really of value to you? I don't get my Xbox, my iPhone. I get my family, my pet, my friends, my home. Those are the things that matter. And yet, GDP does not measure any of that. It doesn't measure any of the stuff that really matters. Friendship, families. It doesn't measure any of the natural resources that support the system. So we need to find a better way of assessing the well-being of our populations. Even Kuznets, who designed GDP, said it's a rubbish way of measuring the well-being of a population. So we have to build a vision, because when people talk about climate change, we hear a lot of negativity, a lot of doom, and it's very easy to talk about an apocalyptic future. What we need is a vision of what it could be like, and it could be better. And that's the thing that we need to use to actually bring ourselves into action, because it won't happen by us sitting around and waiting for someone else to fix it. And there's lots, we already know how to do this. So things like drawdown economics, the drawdown project, looking at all the solutions to climate change. So we could be drawing carbon out of the atmosphere by the middle of the century. Donut economics, looking at how we can live within planetary boundaries in terms of Earth systems and what the safe operating space for humanity where we can live and thrive, but also sort out all of that stuff around access to education, healthcare, equality, all of that stuff. So it could be better in all sorts of ways. We need to be learning from indigenous cultures, particularly the Native American, 7-generation principle, that in our every deliberation we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations.
Nearly done, Hayley.
I am nearly done. I'm nearly done. So we've got COP26 coming up literally in a week or so's time. We know that we've left it so late. We've got to change things really, really fast. And so that's really my big question to you. We know what we need to do. We know that it can make us better. But how do we get there? At the moment, we've had XR, we've had the school strikes that have pushed the Overton window, the kind of what's reasonable to talk about in terms of climate. Much more people are aware of it, but more radical action just seems to be causing frustration. So how do we get the majority of people who now say they're concerned about climate, how do we get them to do more than buying a bamboo toothbrush? How do we get them to be pushing the government? Because the reality is that we can't change it by individual action. It's important, but it's too slow. We need system change. We need the government to be changing so that if we want to use public transport, it's there. We can't use public transport that's not there. The system needs to change to support this. And the only way we can get the government to change the system is for more people to stand up and demand it. So how do we get that to happen? And that's the question that I want to leave you with today. And just as a final thought, thank you for listening.
Thank you, Hayley, very much.
I think there was
Hayley,
have you taken the... Sorry. Thank you so much. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I work at the University of East Anglia in the School of International Development, and I'll pick up on some of these themes and also sort of give you a bit on what we can learn from a global perspective in terms of sustainability. So how much is enough? I think this was a big question that we're trying to answer today, that it can relate to any aspect of our life and lifestyle in terms of how much is enough. So I'm going to actually focus on food because this is an area, both production and consumption, that I do work on. And here there are just 2 alternate food plates, one from an indigenous household in India, in Eastern India, and the other, of course, from here in the UK. And some of these contrasts, how do we really make sense of it from a sustainability perspective? So just last week, I wanted to start with this. There is a global report called the Global Hunger Index, and it was released last week. And you can see the map, and it shows that a lot of people in the world don't have enough to eat, are living in extremely alarming situations in a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, and so on. And the countries in white are basically the countries that have enough, so they're not included into the Global Hunger Index. So what becomes clear is that clearly some people have enough or more than enough to eat, we here, and many others don't have enough to eat. And if you look at the figures in the United States, for instance, an average person consumes something like 3,500 kilocalories a day, which is double of what is consumed in Zambia, Ethiopia, Angola, and many, many other countries. So clearly, we need to change our consumption patterns, not just reduce what we eat, but also eat different. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. So a lot of the countries which are doing very badly is actually also those countries which are in conflict. Now you see the people whose houses are shattered, who don't have, we've seen these images in the newspaper from Afghanistan, from Syria, from many countries. I was told by students from Afghanistan that actually the bank accounts are frozen. So even if they have savings, actually they can't get the money to buy food. So people are hungry due to many different reasons. For them, the first priority is to survive. So when we talk about sustainability and sustainable production, and we go and tell them that, produce sustainably or farm sustainably, it seems not to make sense, because any case, they have to survive, but also they have no money. So they are actually engaging in a lot of natural farming and low input farming in any case. Again, the change has to come somewhere else in the countries you see in red. The white, sorry. The Eat Lancet Commission report actually has very categorically said that for good health, we need to double our consumption of fruits, nuts, vegetables and legumes, and reduce red meats and sugars by more than half. So how is this going to happen? In 2015, that's 6 years ago, the United Nations came up with a sort of what they called as the Sustainable Development Agenda, which had 17 interlinked goals, which looked at a range of things from, responding to climate change, environmental degradation on the one hand, then secure incomes and livelihoods. This is very important, that people have to have enough. But how much is enough? I think that's the question. And the third thing here is about social equality and social justice. Because the minute there's inequality, this also leads to a lot of conflicts. And in fact, we see this, that there is a lot of growing inequality. But sustainable development, I think Hayley before me gave a couple of ways in which we could deal with it. But at the global or economics level, there are also other measures that should we only look at GDP. So there is something called the King of Bhutan, which is a small mountain kingdom in sort of South Asia, actually came up with a concept called gross national happiness. He said we should actually measure happiness and not incomes. And this happiness include things like green spaces, environment, it included culture and cultural identity, it included also good governance and politics, not politically always fraught situations. It also, of course, included our own socio-economic position. But the New Economics Foundation here has sort of picked up this idea and developed something called the Happy Planet Index. And what they find in this Happy Planet Index, they have used things like life satisfaction, happiness, but very important, I think, from today's discussion is ecological footprint. And actually, on top in the Happy Planet Index is Costa Rica, then Dominica, Panama, a lot of countries which we wouldn't expect in Central America. The United Kingdom comes, after 100 out of 178, 108, I think, and the US is much, much below at 150. And how does Costa Rica stay on top? I think it has renewable energy, something that Hayley mentioned. It sort of preserves biodiversity, tries to reduce ecological footprint, but also very importantly, I think ensures sort of equitable access to education, health, universal pensions, so to reduce inequality. I think this is a very important element of happiness. So I think it sort of raises the question that perhaps if we consume less, we might actually be happier. We will not be stressing, oh, my laptop has crashed, something else is not working. We'll probably have a much more happier and relaxed, stress-free time, not all the time looking at our telephones, if we actually consume a little bit less. So I just wanted to say a little bit on global inequalities. So even the UK, in one of their net zero reports, actually they have said, the UK government, that we can only address climate change if we also address poverty at the same time. Because the minute there's inequality, there's going to be conflict, there's going to be killings. I think we read it in the newspaper, an MP gets killed. I think these are not good signs for any society to be in a sort of conflictual, violent mode. And here, if we look at sort of latest inequalities, it's not just about incomes, it's in everything. It's inequalities in mortality, it's inequalities in schooling, it's inequalities in life expectancy. We find huge inequalities across the world. And what I wanted to say is that this is not accidental, but this is actually the result of politics. This is the result of unequal power relations between countries, but also within countries we find. Whether it's race inequality, I think she gave some examples, whether it's gender inequality, class inequality. I think there are also these differences within countries that we do need to address.
Sorry, Nitya.
Yeah. So I'll just very quickly give you a fact that, when we talk about sustainability, in the food sector, there are 4 sort of big companies which control 60% of seeds, 70% of agrochemical fertilizers. And clearly they are deciding what needs to be done. And states are very complicit in this. So as individuals, while we can take action, I think the point that individuals can't do everything. And some of these nexuses, power relations between states and corporates, has to be broken. So just a couple of examples, I think, from my work of what we can learn about sustainability and sustainable living. And these examples are from India, that again, because of this corporate control of inputs, high input production, which is also not good for the environment, and very negative price fixation by these large companies. A lot of farmers in rural areas of South Asia, for instance, they can't really survive on farming. So the men basically leave, they migrate to the cities, they migrate to other places for work. The women are left behind. Their burdens of work increase. But I think it also gives us hope when we look at sort of disaggregated things about collective action, that there are very interesting interventions now that how convert a problem into a solution, that there are these women left with the farms and left with farming with not many resources. Can we collectivize them and actually go into low input agriculture using intercropping, multiple cropping, mulching, soil and water conservation to actually lead to more sustainable farming? And very interestingly, I think while I don't condone the inequality, but actually there is less pressure on women to produce for profit. I mean, it's generally assumed that women are just looking after the household, and therefore they're able to do different and experiment. So that's, I think, an interesting, and I just want to move to some things about, again, the power inequalities and the way they work at local levels, and just move with to say that the way, how do we move ahead? Business as usual is no longer an option. We do need critical shifts, a radical transformation of our food systems from production to consumption in order to ensure good health, both for ourselves and for the planet. And of course, this needs a shift not only in farming or production systems, but also in trade, in the health system, in educational system, what is taught, what people learn, what they value, in export imports, and so on. It cannot be done just by focusing on the food system alone. And my last concluding point is really something that we are doing in the UK very locally with the Norwich Institute for Sustainable Development, that promoting the use of pulses and legumes in the UK and beyond in terms of healthy, eating and living healthily within planetary boundaries. But this is not straightforward either, because we need to understand, where is consumer demand? What are people's preferences? Just because we say that, eat legumes, are people going to eat it? Will farmers grow it? What are the incentives for farmers that they need to grow it? How does it affect our nutrition and our gut health? And finally, what are the strategies for crop improvement? These are quite complex things to bring about behavior change in people. So in the short run, I think I would like to just conclude with a point also made, suggested by Hayley, that we can reduce food. I started with the food plates. I think we can reduce food waste. We know that about 30% of food actually is wasted in the UK at different levels, whether it's the supermarkets, whether it's at home. If we reduce this food waste, just eat what is enough and just purchase what is enough, I think we will be, in the very near term, both able to protect our environment, but also provide sufficient food to people across the world. Thank you very much.
Microphone working? Right, you can all hear me. So, right, as you can see from this not very flattering photo, I'm angry. I'm angry and I'm not alone. Generations X, Y, and Z are increasingly furious at the world we are set to inherit. Understandably so, our lives will be dominated by the environmental issues created over the past decades. And this will affect everyone we will ever love: husbands, wives, children, grandchildren, and so on. Why am I angry? I'm angry because the world is already on fire. I'm angry because we're already drowning in our own waste. I'm angry because we're killing all of the animals on the planet, including the ones that look like us. That sweet orangutan. And we're killing ourselves too. As Hayley pointed out, air pollution already kills an estimated 8 million people a year, and that number is only rising. I wasn't born angry, but I was brought up green. My mum was one of the early sustainability campaigners, and so off of the back of the work that she did, and actually my godfather, Jonathon Elkington, and even Jonathon Porritt, who I now have the pleasure of sharing the stage with, but I grew up watching him on TV. I started out, this was a bit of a double-edged sword, because of course, while learning about all of the challenges that humanity faced, this started to build a sense of fear. And as Hayley's statistics pointed out, I grew up quite scared for my future, and already from a young age talking to my mum about how I should consider potentially adopting or whatnot, with this thinking about my impact on the future and what the future held for me. That fear turned to anger as I had what seemed like a relatively long time growing up, while relatively little seemed to happen. And fortunately, that anger has given way to a determination to disrupt the trajectory that we're currently on and chart a new course for humanity, hopefully saving my future in the process. But the problem is incremental change is not enough. So far, we have been doing too little, too slowly. Oh. Okay. Yeah, but we've skipped ahead a lot. Wait a second. Oh, come on. Okay, well, we've skipped a slide, but the slide in between was our problems are huge and they're global. Okay? We've also had quite a lot of time and we've squandered it. Now, I've got an awful example of that, which you'll have to ask me afterwards, because otherwise I'm going to run out of time during my talk, but bring it up in questions. Oh, for God's sake, okay. It may seem like we're doing a lot, because it's now a lot more in the news, lots of people are talking about these issues, but this is the 26th COP. Frankly, we've done a lot of talking and not much doing. As Greta says, a lot of blah, blah, blah. The other thing that we've had, and this has been mentioned by both the speakers coming on before, we've had a big focus on personal responsibility. Now, of course, we can all do a lot, and actually as individuals, when we group together and we change the way that we act en masse, we have massive influence on the planet. But the focus on personal responsibility, recycling in your own homes, critiquing environmentalists for not having electric cars or flying, despite there being not any reasonable alternatives or affordable alternatives at the time, is part of the distraction. And this distraction has been enabled by governments, but fueled, I think this is running out of power. Okay, fueled by, oh my God, fueled by those most responsible for the problem, which is the big companies like this, who've tried to, this is ExxonMobil's one of their refinery plants, shifted the responsibility to the consumer. In fact, the term carbon footprint was invented by some marketeers working for BP. Okay, of course, their carbon footprint is much bigger than yours, but they wanted you to focus on your footprint and not theirs. This distraction has obviously made us slow to react. I think it is going to skip through to the next slide. Nope. Okay. What we need is radical change. Part of that radical change involves educating our children for the future they will actually inherit, not the future that we used to think that they might have. So equipping them to really deal with the challenges of today. Oh, this is irritating. Okay. We need big solutions. With big problems, we need big solutions, and we need to have a big global approach. These problems may not be in our backyard, but they will affect us, and so we need to treat them as if they are in our backyard. This, by the way, is a project by Michael Paulin, looking to build a forest within the Sahara Desert. Increasingly frustrating. Okay, not this slide, one before. Okay, this one. Okay, we need to be prepared to spend a lot of money. Okay, this is going to cost a lot to fix, but the longer we wait, the more it is going to cost us. Okay, so yes, politicians might tell you it's expensive, but it is the only option. And as I say, delay will only cost us more. We have to be prepared to disrupt and change industries that exist. Some industries cannot continue. And while that might mean people losing jobs, that is better than all future generations losing their lives. So we have to be prepared to make the tough decisions and make those quickly. Of course, we want to support those that we are displacing, but we have to be prepared to be radical. We have to disrupt every industry. This is not just about the coal miners or agriculture. Every single industry we have plays a part in the economic system that currently is destroying the planet. Whether you are an accountant or a lawyer or a dentist, you play a role in this big machine, and therefore you have a part to play in charting a new course. I mean, take accountants and lawyers. They, of course, work with these big companies that are doing the destruction. You can't chop down the rainforest or exploit oil out of the Arctic without accountants or lawyers or other people that allow your business to run. So their hands are not as clean as they might think. What am I doing about this? Well, I have focused on the issue of rubbish. We create masses of waste. And so I'm focused on bringing about a circular economy. That means shifting from our current model, linear model of consumption, where we take resources out of the ground, we make them into things, and we dispose of them. This is inherently unsustainable. We live in a world with finite resources, peddling a model of infinite consumption. Those two things are inherently incompatible and therefore unsustainable. Whereas a circular model of consumption, where resources are kept in a continual loop, is, by its very nature, sustainable. And it copies the natural cycles that are infinitely sustaining from the natural world, the water cycle, the cycle of life and death. And so it allows us to live in harmony with nature and in harmony with the planet. Okay, next slide. Yes, I've set up two companies in this space, both with rubbish in the name, Rubbish Ideas and the Rubbish Project. Rubbish Ideas is a sustainable design consultancy, and the Rubbish Project is, well, we're working with large organizations to push that shift from a linear economy to a circular one. So the world's largest producers of disposable packaging and consumers, we are helping them shift to a model where their packaging is made entirely from old packaging, and it is recycled back into new packaging at its end of life, creating a zero-waste system. Under Rubbish Ideas, one of the exciting things that we're doing with waste is we are taking calcium carbonate. We're about to start a project where waste calcium carbonate from a mining operation is 3D printed into coral reefs, which are used as artificial defenses from the rising sea, but also to repair the damage we have done to marine ecosystems. So, in conclusion, Greta and Extinction Rebellion and all of the other groups championing this issue are right to be angry. But what they're also asking for, and they are absolutely right in, is radical change. We need to radically change the way we are approaching these issues. Otherwise, it will be a disruptive future or no future at all. Thank you very much.
No slides. You see, poor Connor, I felt for you. I felt for you all the way through that, and that's one of the reasons why I don't really use slides, actually. You could possibly even turn the light down a tiny bit, but thank you so much. To be honest, that was absolutely fantastic from our three speakers because it showed you exactly the balance between reasons to be hopeful and reasons to be both very angry and occasionally despairing. And it is precisely that emotional, psychological balance that we are all wrestling with in our own lives at the moment, as you know. Day by day, we try and make sense of this. We have this extraordinary array of inputs into our life telling us just how bad things are. Pretty much every day there's another story about another bit of the planet at risk, about another part of the human family being undermined or destroyed by the way in which we're choosing to live today. It is literally remorseless and unceasing. On the other hand, we increasingly find that there are just so many solutions to the problems that we now find. And I feel really pleased today that everybody wanted to persuade you that it is not for a lack of solutions that we're in the mess that we're in. I wrote a book back in 2012 called The World We Made, looking back from 2050 at what would need to happen to get us to a good place by 2050, a reasonably good place. Not some kind of Panglossian nirvana, I can assure you, but a reasonably good place. And so many of those solutions since then, since 2012, have really started to shape what this alternative world would look like. I had quite a few encounters with realists in those days, including one of the most senior advisors to the government at that time in 2012, who described the entire notion of renewable electricity in the world as, quotes, an appalling delusion. He was absolutely persuaded that the only way forward would be to go on using fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage and nuclear power. In the intervening years, we have seen country after country get hold of this renewable challenge and turn it into something quite extraordinary. So we now get 44% of our electricity from renewables here in the UK. By the end of next year, it will be nearly 55% of our electricity, and we're on our way to getting 100% of our electricity from 2035. This stuff happens if, as you heard, people and politicians put their minds to making it happen. So that's the first thing, no shortage of ideas. The second thing is you have to make this hopefulness a practice. You can't just take it for granted that you're going to be able to call on the power of this solutions agenda unless you do it explicitly. You have to kind of work on this. It took me a long time. I've been at this for nearly 50 years. Thanks, Connor, for reminding me of that. And it's taken me a long time to realize that you can't just assume that you will keep the balance right between these different things. So I now really carefully manage the amount of good stuff that I put myself close to, experience, feel, and the bad stuff that I can't avoid because I still need to be able to understand what's going on in the world today. So find those practitioners of hope who are really making things happen. Very simple example. Just last week, a new book was published called Seeds to Solutions, featuring the work of the really extraordinary Pam Warhurst, who more than a decade ago came up with this wonderful idea of incredible edible. It started in a small Yorkshire town, incredible edible Todmorden, and it has now spread, I wouldn't put it quite like all around the world, but it has spread very, very widely. And this book, Seeds to Solutions, just shows 40 or 50 of these local campaigns that have taken off, planting food everywhere in people's local communities. It's a very powerful idea, but it's very small at the moment, so it has to grow, which means you need to see ways of replicating and building this and amplifying it every turn. That's what the book is essentially about. It's local. There are solutions nationally, of course. There are solutions internationally and globally, of course. But the really powerful thing about local solutions, it's the bit that we can get hold of. So I don't know where you would feel on this spectrum, whether you think people change because they get an idea in their head first and then once they've got that idea, their lifestyles or their actions or their decisions follow from it, or whether you subscribe to the alternative view, which I am more tempted by, which is that the action and being involved in something leads to a change in people's beliefs, leads to a change in the way they see themselves in the world. So beliefs follows action rather than action following a change in your mindset or your belief. It's a bit like the difference between a meme, where you get this very powerful idea that suddenly sweeps through society and grabs a bit of our collective psyche, as it were, versus antibodies. And we're all quite good at antibodies these days. For me, I am really fascinated at the things that need to happen. Not to be discussed or talked about, but need to happen to build these practices of hope. The last thing I just want to say is this. Wherever we take this argument about the need to keep a balance between hope and despair, the practical actions available to us all, we absolutely have to find a way of making that relevant to young people. Again, I completely agree with Connor about this. Young people today have every reason to be utterly enraged at our failure. And there are so many amazing young people out there today doing incredible things. They understand the power of hope in practice. Again, another very quick example of another little book just published a few weeks ago by the rather amazing Maya Rose Craig, sometimes known as Bird Girl, who when she was 12 set up an organization called Black to Nature to persuade people from different communities, ethnic communities, to get involved in nature and conservation. She's published a book featuring the lives of 30 young indigenous activists all around the world. And the title of the book is We Have a Dream. And if you really want to have a little bit of an uplift, next time you're thinking that life is just getting a bit too gloomy, get hold of a copy of this book, because it is wonderful. And it's one of so many of these examples of power. One of the questions we were asked to address this afternoon is, how do we get there? How do we make all the solutions come alive in people's lives? Do not think this is so big a challenge that you can't be part of it. Because if you've already come to the conclusion that it's too big to deal with, then we've lost the battle. We will have lost it at that stage if people just think it can't be done. So I've deliberately wanted to keep this local, practice-based, hope-based. But the final thing you have to admit is you also have to think about yourselves as political animals. None of this stuff will work unless we are able to change the contours of the political system on which we depend. You heard Hayley say, this is as much about people as citizens as it is about people as consumers. And keep that in your mind, because if this solutions-based approach is going to work, to come through the system like that, it really has to involve each and every one of us as an active citizen in the systems of which we're a part. Back to you, boss.
Can we thank you so much, all the speakers. Wonderful, very powerful, and hope-creating. So I'm going to just start the process. What I'd like you to do is to raise questions or comments. We have about half an hour, and the speakers will take notes of what you're saying, so you get maximum opportunity to say the things you want to say from what you've heard and also what you may want to add to the conversation. And then I'll ask the speakers in the order in which they spoke to comment on what you're saying. And then we'll try and draw all this together. And I'm so keen on all this activity and what Willem is doing that we'll probably put together a short summary that we'll put out into the Norwich Science Festival. So this is your chance, and we'll have 2 microphones. Raise your hand, and we will ask you to raise a question. If you feel that the question is asked stores you to say, I'd like to follow that up, wave your hands twice, and you'll get first call over anyone else waving hands. If you don't wave your hands twice, you've had it. This lady over here first, and I'm leaving this now. I don't know whether you can give me a machine.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Lucy Galvin. I'm a councillor with Norwich City Council, a Green councillor. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Amazing presentations, and to the people that have organised today, and to everyone that's come. I love the focus on hope. I wanted to ask the question, what do you think specifically Norwich City Council can do? But also to say to everyone here, I totally agree, you can get involved locally in your democratic politics, ask questions of the council, talk to your councillors. There is a local government level where solutions can lie, and I've seen things change in local government and at the county level as well. So I wanted to ask what you think the solutions are locally. Thank you.
Serious engagement with the political, particularly at the local. Think of that and come some answers. Who else? Anyone to follow that up on the political front? Engagement with those who are solely trying to control our lives, which must not be allowed to do so. Lady here.
Thank you. Is that on? Can you hear me? It is on. Okay. Hi, I'm Sabina Varani, and I'm with Green New Deal Norwich, and really appreciate the comments about practice and getting engaged in the political process. Green New Deal Norwich, we're open to newcomers. We'd love to have you along. One of the projects we're working on right now is trying to work with the City Council to set up a food partnership that, so the City Council recently signed the Glasgow Food and Climate Declaration, which we were very pleased about. But of course, signatories are meant to then set up a food strategy that deals with climate change. In Green New Deal Norwich, we really want to see a strategy that's based not just in climate change, but in environmental justice overall, social justice, including racial justice, and also economic justice. And so I guess I also have a question about how do we work with the City Council to take such a bold step, and also, again, just to invite anyone who's interested to come talk to me afterwards and get involved. Thank you.
May I ask one of you to look into that in the presentation? Any other questions or comments? Right next to you, lady here.
Just to ask Sabina to tell people about the film that's tomorrow, Monday.
Thanks, Leslie. Yeah, we are showing the award-winning documentary at Cinema City on Monday night. Many of you may have heard about it. It's called The Ants and the Grasshopper. It follows a farmer from Malawi, around her farm in Malawi, and all of the difficulties they're having with lack of rain. And then she goes on a journey to the United States, talking to farmers and politicians there. You can imagine the kind of conversations she has. And we have two wonderful speakers as part of our panelist afterwards. I have to say, tickets are pretty much sold out unless you are in a wheelchair. But we'd love to have you engaged in the conversation afterwards. Thank you.
This gentleman here.
Okay. Hi, it's Glenn Buckingham. I'm a farmer in Suffolk, a conventional farmer in Suffolk. And I have one or two office holder roles in agriculture. What I want to know is how much the panel thinks current agriculture has to be disrupted to make the changes we need.
Anyone want to talk about farming, land use, disruption, so we can keep that theme going? And there's plenty of people on the panel can answer that. Right there. This lady here.
Thank you. Emily Norton, local farmer as well, also work at Savills for PLC. So I'm quite interested in this land use change question. And I think it's really a question of the just transition. I don't perceive in my role that there's any shortage of money seeking to solve these problems. What that money is trying to achieve is scale, and the scale will bring disruption. So Jonathon, in particular, I'll be really interested in your thoughts on how we continue to bring people on the journey when the journey is going to be so disrupted in terms of land use, in terms of systems, and in terms of really what is actually sustainable. And I suppose my big interest is what's after net zero. I'd like to think that we achieve all of this by some means or the other, but what kind of society we're left with? And I think that's the really big question I'm mulling in my mind. Thank you.
Thank you. Lady here. Anyone else on food, local food, that area? Do you want to make a comment? This
Hello, my name's Jeannie. I'm from Suffolk, and I'm a farmer of just 24 acres, and I grow local food with local people. And it's about how very successful it's been in involving people in the local community. We grow a lot of food that is consumed locally, and I'd like to know what ideas, how we can move that project further so that every settlement has local food growing around it.
Very important question. Okay, anyone else on food, local, anything like that? Or we can go to another question. Who else would like to raise something? This gentleman here.
Hello, I'm Mark. I work for TCV, the Conservation Volunteers. So we try and get people involved in practical action to look after green spaces for people and wildlife. Particularly in the first presentation, there was a lot of talk about health and getting people to do more sort of healthy exercise outdoors rather than over-consuming. We've got a lot of evidence already that this approach definitely works. But we have this constant frustration of the conventional health system wanting to prescribe people drugs, but not so much actual action. So what can we do and who can we talk to persuade the health system to solve its own problems by getting people out and active? Thank you.
Hayley, you ready for that sometime down the line? Anyone to follow that up or keep this theme going for a second?
Hello, I'm Alina from the Norwich Eco Hub. We've got an event coming up soon about mental health and climate change and how to deal with all the bad news, the future, the way it's going to look. What can I tell our audience at that event? How can we make it, how can we make them find hope?
Jonathan, thank you for that. Anyone else want to raise anything on these topics or related topics? Gentlemen here.
Hello, my name is John from Anglia Print. We're regarded as the greenest printing company in the UK by Greenpeace. I find that there's several issues that I have a problem with. The biggest one is not convincing people sitting here. Majority of us will be convinced that the environment, the planet needs help, and we'll be doing our bits to help that along. What we've got to do is convince people out there what needs doing. And the biggest thing that I find that I come across is that cheap wins. The mindset of cheap wins is our biggest drawback. It's cheaper to throw into the ocean as a way of getting rid of waste. It's cheaper to let pollution come out the back of the car. Sorry. It's cheaper to go to Primark, buy your clothes, than actually get something that's sustainable. And it is based a little bit on what Hayley was saying about the GDPR. It's not a correct model for running an economy anymore. And I'd like to know ways around that to get past cheap wins.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Cynthia, and I'm the co-founder of TREE, which is a transplant recycling initiative for the environment. So I had a kidney transplant myself many years ago, more than 20 years ago, and I waste a lot of pill packaging. And with one of the other co-founders who's a heart transplant, we've decided that we have to do something about the pill packaging industry, which is millions of tons of pill packaging a year that is non-recyclable. So we need help to do so. And I don't really have a specific question, is just to ask if there would be a collaboration. Yeah, that's it.
We have good time, so what I'm going to suggest is if we break for a second, you had quite a few questions, and ask members of the panel to respond to what's come up and then think again as we're getting responses.
So there was lots around what the City Council can do, lots around food systems and agriculture, and to some extent I'm going to leave that to Nitya, because that's your area of expertise and not mine. I'm not a farmer. But what I do know is that a more plant-based diet is healthier in terms of, of people, and massively healthier for the planet. But what I wanted to pick up there was someone who said about the health system, and at the moment what we have is not a national health system, we have a national sickness system. We wait for people to get sick and then we treat them. And the health sector itself is contributing to environmental damage. We are about 5% of admissions and also quite a lot of environmental, wider environmental damage. So that's why I work for this organisation, which is trying to reduce that. And as that was at lunch earlier. What did I say to you? So in terms of how we make healthcare sustainable, out of 4 kind of principles of that, the first 2 are prevention and getting patients to be self-empowered to manage their own illness. So things like access to green space, things like getting people to eat differently and be more active. That then helps the NHS to achieve its own net zero goal, because we have less people coming in the door because less people are sick. So what we need to be is focusing more on public health interventions, focusing more at engaging with communities and engaging with kind of patient groups to get those changes off the ground. And one of the things that's happening around that is social prescribing. So to some extent, when you say you want the health sector to listen, you're starting to push at an open door, because what's happening is we're trying to get people more to social prescribing, where they have somebody who comes and helps them to get out, helps them to link in with stuff in the community, helps them to get more active, rather than prescribing them an antidepressant or something for their blood pressure or something for their, the cholesterol, because actually those things, they wouldn't probably need those medications if they were living a different lifestyle. And that's not their fault. And that's really, really important to make clear. The way our system is set up, and particularly in terms of social inequality, it makes it very, very difficult for a lot of people to make those choices. And that's why we need system change. I've probably gone on too long. Shall I hand on the mic? Yeah. I just wanted to say about the event around mental health and eco-distress. Yeah. All the evidence says one of the most important things is to listen and validate. Eco-distress is not a mental health disorder. It is a rational response to what's happening. So that's really, really important to let these young people know they're not sick. They're suffering from reality, and the real treatment is for the adults to get on and do something. Not therapy, not medication, but actually to deal with the environmental crisis. But in terms of individually, and it's not just young people, it's adults, it's so tough to be a parent in this, to look at the future for our children. Nobody's done a survey of parents. It's not just young people, it's all of us that are suffering from this. And the things that we know help. One is to honor that pain, allow yourself some space to really experience it, rather than keep pushing it to the side. But the most important thing, and I think Jonathon talked about this as well, is to balance it with hope. Don't always read the negative stuff. Read the positive stuff. Read Drawdown. Read Active Hope. Read those kind of books. But most important of all, get active, get involved. Because if you have all this stuff in your head, sometimes it's really isolating, because we're all living in this community where loads of people are going around as if nothing is happening, and you're the weird one. And you're kind of thinking, am I crazy? You keep going back to it. And it makes you feel like you're screaming in a room full of your friends and no one's listening to you. And sometimes it can make you really angry with people you otherwise love and respect. So being able to spend time with other people who get it is incredibly important. And doing stuff that helps you to build hope is incredibly important. So those are the things that I would say to that event. And if you want to talk to me about that, I'm happy to give you my contact details.
Wonderful point. Well, picking up on that last mental health point, I mean, eco-distress is a new term, but I've heard it called eco-anxiety. And actually, I learned that term from this wonderful girl called Clover Hogan, and she has set up a wonderful organization called Force of Nature, which I recommend checking out. It's all about eco-anxiety and can be incredibly empowering, hearing the stories of people who've suffered from eco-anxiety and then turned that into, you know, a sort of driver for change. Because I say, you know, I grew up quite scared for my future, and that can be, fear can be quite paralyzing. It, you know, can in a way make you almost want to do nothing. Whereas, of course, what we really need people to feel is empowered to make change, possibly draw off the anger more than the fear. Yeah, so check out Force of Nature if you want to look at that issue. But one of the questions John asked was, how can we beat the cheap wins mentality? Well, the simple answer to that is that we need to make destroying the planet expensive and protecting the planet cheap. Currently, we have the opposite order. In fact, we subsidize destroying the planet. So oil extraction, fossil fuels are heavily subsidized still to this day by governments around the world. In fact, more of your tax money goes to supporting fossil fuels than it does to supporting environmental initiatives, which is obviously counter to probably what you'd want. And so we need to switch that mentality. We need to switch, we need to make it much more expensive to do wrong, and we need to make it cheaper to do the right thing. So tax the bejesus out of destroying the planet and you know, incentivize protecting it. Cynthia, on the recycling point around medical packaging. Medical waste is an interesting area and a difficult challenge in terms of waste and single use, because there is often this perception that single-use products are always bad, always the least environmentally friendly option. That is not actually true. What matters when we're using things is the least amount of carbon and the least amount of waste from a certain number of uses. Now, if we switch to a reusable model in hospitals, the challenge we face is that we have to keep those reusable products hygienic so that we don't kill the next patient. And the way of making it hygienic is quite energy intensive. So actually, we don't necessarily want to switch away from single-use products in a hospital setting, because that meets our requirements in terms of sort of being hygienic. But what we do need to do is switch towards a circular economy approach to that packaging. That packaging should 100% be made from recycled material, and it should never go to waste again. Hospitals are controlled environments, so they are the perfect place for segregated waste streams. And so, you know, that is what we should be focusing on. This also builds greater resilience into our healthcare systems. When we had the pandemic, we had an immediate shortage of PPE. Why was that? All of our PPE is produced the other side of the world. And of course, they're going to produce their own PPE first before giving it to us. This is, of course, logical. Whereas if in our own country, we could take our PPE waste and we could recycle it back into new PPE locally, then of course you're never going to run out of PPE, because as soon as you're consuming it, you're making more from the waste that you've thrown away. So not only is it more sustainable, it's a safer situation to be in too. This is actually a project that I'm already working on. So we're working with a company that devised these machines that we put outside hospitals that melt down the plastic aprons and masks and curtains, turn them into a block of plastic that's much easier for us to transport and then recycle. Well, I haven't gone on to pill packaging, but I'll add it to the list. I think that's probably, I'll let you talk about food.
Yeah, thank you. I think there were some interesting things about farming and local farms and so on. And in fact, Norwich City Council has been doing quite well in terms of supporting community farms. It was near the UEA, but also Helsden and other places that actually encouraging, giving the information, giving the knowledge about using sustainable practices. So I think there does need to be investment into, I think an important area for local farming, local consumption is actually knowledges, because I spoke about the big companies controlling the knowledge about, you know, put in so much of fertilizers, put in so much of pesticides, and so on. And actually the streams for knowledge dissemination on local or organic is much less. And I think that's where, in terms of, you know, access to knowledge, access to practices, I think these are all there. I mean, the solutions are all there. We have a lot of knowledge about agroecological approaches, but these are not publicized. They're there in the books and so on. And the companies, the advertising is pushing on certain practices. So I think, probably linking up to local farming and already the initiatives which the Norwich City Council is doing. I think I was very pleased to hear you mention sort of the idea of justice, that it has to be based on a principle of social, economic, and environmental justice. I think that's really important, that what often happens with the organic foods is that it is, because they're higher priced, it's the better off who can afford it, and the poorest don't get access to the really good, nutritious food. I think the other day we were talking about aquatic foods and fish and so on as well. The ones that are really good for health is but outpriced. So the bottom 20% don't get access to these foods. So I think the one thing is about keeping in mind the equality or the inequalities in distribution. And I think this is a point that Connor just made about, not really cheap wins, but investing in also in equality. That how can we invest, whether it's in terms of pricing, whether it's in terms of availability, affordability of sort of inputs which are organic, which are accessible to people who want to use it. Often the fertilizers are much cheaper. So how do we actually balance this to make sure that people who do want to adopt these solutions are facilitated? I think there's no solution. I mean, investment is important. I don't think it can be done on the cheap. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, that's covered off all of that lot. On farming non-locally, as it were, I mean, all farmers are local, but some of the changes that are coming are obviously much bigger than just changes in one's own backyard or in the local community, and the disruption is going to have to be pretty profound, basically, because if you look at the balance of where the greenhouse gases that we're concerned about come from, obviously today's intensive agricultural systems around the world are a massive contributor to that. We focus less on it than we probably should. So it is going to be huge. It is going to be scary. It is happening. I mean, the weird thing is that the UK is going to be one of the first countries which is going to have to do something about this, because we've made a decision to get out of the insane common agricultural policy, whether people were in favor of that or not. The old system was pretty wretched, let's be honest, where farmers more or less got money for the amount of land they had, not quite, but more or less. And we are going to move towards something called environmental land management payments. And nobody quite knows what that's going to look like yet, but it could be good. I mean, I struggle to say nice things about this government. Really, I do, because it's not a pretty picture. But honestly, if we seized hold of this and we followed up on Henry Dimbleby's food strategy, which is a pretty good starting point, then we really could see some changes coming. And I have to say, just a quick word, farmers are not against this. The position now being adopted by a lot of farmers, including, I might say, the NFU and Minette Batters, who's pressing farmers to say, get your act together. We have to be net zero by 2040, which is a kind of revolution, the like of which I suspect most farmers would much rather not contemplate. But it is a fairly astonishing journey ahead, and not necessarily a bad one. I think a really exciting one for people who want to put land at the center of this. So Tim, I won't bang on about this. Just one thing. Mark, thank you from TCV, as president of TCV, go man, go. And I think you said, Hayley, be active. There is no better organization to be active with than with TCV. And on pills, perhaps I could have a word with you at the end. It just so happens serendipitously that Forum for the Future has a session with a very large drugs company in 2 weeks' time to talk about things like that. So I can't tell you which one, because obviously you'd think, God, does he really talk to people like that? Yes is the answer, because you do have to.
Another burst of questions, but 10 minutes for comments, stirred up by what we've already heard from our panel. And you know the kind of things they would like to react to. So who would like to add to our discussion?
Hello, my name is Frances Kemp. I'm an ordinary citizen anxious about climate change, but I'm also something called a climate ambassador for the Women's Institute. There's not very many of us, and we're in the main women of older years, of which I'm one, although I haven't gone grey yet. I feel we've had good lives. We've got loads of stuff. But locally, I find that it's very difficult. People find it very difficult to talk about climate change. So reflecting on Hayley's comment, am I the mad one or am I not? And I think it's all seen as rather too political, but it's not political, it's a real humanitarian issue. So I've got two questions. One is, how do we get this generation of women to be active when it perhaps hasn't been their modus operandi throughout their lives? And secondly, how do we persuade them that actually, I mean, I get told, well, it's not our problem, it's all to do with China. How do we persuade them and make them aware that actually we've offshored a lot of our manufacturing, and a lot of stuff comes from China. And you know, I was shocked recently to find a Tesco's bag of salmon from China, and all the lateral flow tests I'm taking at the moment, because my mother's in a nursing home, all come from China. So it's not that we're not producing global emissions because we're a tiny country. It's because we've offshored a huge amount of what we produce. So thank you very much.
Very struck by the antibody metaphor that Jonathon used at the beginning, but slightly perplexed as well. My understanding of an antibody is of something which reacts automatically in defense of the body, and in that sense it's an attractive concept, because antibodies don't sit and agonize about the scale of the problem or wonder where to start first. It's a potentially attractive model to go out of here and think about. But I'm struggling with, where are the antibodies that will automatically be available to us to trigger the positive reaction to the problems we have?
Disruptive antibody. Try that. Who else would like to raise a question? The lady behind you here.
Thank you. I'm Leslie Graham. I want to make the point that net zero is not zero. It's a unicorn technology. It's a unicorn piece of greenwash that relies on technologies that have never been proven at scale. So how do we get people to move away from the unicorn greenwash to actually upscaling the things that we know really work?
Good question. Excellent question. Who else would like to? A couple more. There's a gentleman up here, there's a lady here, and there's a you can bring.
It's on. It's on.
Yeah,
it's just of interest to me that with all the, I was going to say nonsense, but hot air that's come out, that no one has even mentioned 88 million more people will be here in a year's time. And if we're going to be sharing things on a fair level, are they going to have what we've got? Because if so, you're wasting your time.
Jonathon, I know that's one of your themes, so I would certainly expect you to respond to that. Is that gentleman here?
Hello, my name is Charlie Watson. I'm a small-scale publisher, and I've actually been a customer of John, who's the eco-printer and the fantastic one who asked the question about cheap wins. And we're embedded in the system. You know, I produce projects and make books for clients who demand the cheapest. You know, and I've tried to put projects with John, as he knows, and we've not been able to do it because cheap wins. And I'm in the system, and I'm trying not to let cheap win, but the whole force of the system that we have, the free market, capitalist, and so on and so on, forces me to collaborate in the cheap wins mentality. Connor responded to that and said, tax them, tax this, tax that, which is great. That's what you can do, I guess, within, that's what governments can do within the system we have now. But my question then is, are there other things we can do within the system we have now, or do we need to look at some fundamental change that I haven't got in my head, but change that would mean I could take projects and get them to John rather than to the company that manages to be the cheapest all the time, and therefore almost certainly not the most eco-sensitive and best for the planet. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a common question for all our panel, I'm sure, in one form or another. Any other points to be raised, and then we'll draw this to a...
Could I raise one? Could I raise one as the organiser?
You want to ask a question?
Yes, I wouldn't mind, yeah, because I've been thinking about this for a year as I organised this, and it just occurred to me, it's the need to have a vision, all right? And that's one of the things I put about having myths and stories, that so we have the right sort of thoughts in our minds. I'd be interested to hear from each of the panel, do they have a vision in their minds of what this sustainable future would look like for them? Could they just describe it?
There you are. In a few minutes. Jonathon, I'm going to ask you to start with population, bit about sustainability, and then move across to...
Okay. So, Willem, I can answer your question immediately. You just need to get hold of a copy of The World We Made, and there you will see my full vision of what life will look like in the year 2050, okay? Yeah, you can still get them, I think online only, unfortunately, but there we go. So population, yes, well, I'm also president of an organization called Population Matters, and population matters to me because it is a really big issue, and we do need to do what we can about it. I didn't go there today because I sort of scanned the room, and it's an audience that I suppose you're thinking, isn't the right time for practical advice about how many children you should all be having or anything like that. But to take it seriously, there is a lot that we in a rich world country like this can do about promoting progressive, non-coercive, intelligent, smart, rights-led ideas about family planning, reproductive health care, education for girls around the world. Because the biggest issue that we all face is something like 250 million women are not able to manage their own fertility. Such a high percentage of girls are not able to continue in school to the point where they would be able to do what we take for granted. So we have to address things at that level. And that it wasn't sort of part of the running order for today, but it is, all of that stuff is there. And if you, I think, was it you, Hayley, mentioned Project Drawdown, or was it Project Drawdown? If you look at Project Drawdown, which is a brilliant thing, by the way, because it presents what so many of the solutions to this climate crisis look like. Amazingly, education for girls, reproductive health care, and access to a choice of free contraception is one of the most effective ways of addressing the climate emergency. I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive, but think about it for a moment. It is one of the most effective ways. So the join is absolutely there. Sorry, Tim, I could go on about that, but I definitely shouldn't. Can I just say something about net zero and unicorn greenwash before you all get yourselves into a kind of complete state of moral indignation that this is another bit of greenwash? Look, we need ideas that help people to understand what is going on out there. It is impossible to get to zero greenhouse gas emissions in the immediate future. It's completely impossible. We're embedded so deep in a fossil fuel economy that there's no way we're going to jump from here straight to a zero greenhouse gas economy within 10, 15, 20 years. It's just not going to happen. So net zero, where we work as much as we possibly can to reduce those emissions through efficiency, different technology, et cetera, is, and then when there are still going to be residual emissions in the system, then we have to think about how we do offsets properly. Please don't get too cynical about this. Yes, get cynical about some things. Get very cynical about BP saying it's going to be a net zero company by 2050. I mean, obviously that's total bollocks. But do not get cynical about people who are genuinely trying to make the net zero story work in order to come up with staged, step-by-step routes to dramatic decarbonization and taking responsibility for all the other bits that you can't deal with immediately. We sometimes lurch a bit into too much skepticism, I think. I've run out of time, I know. Antibodies, okay, let's just have a little chat at the end of it. See, antibodies, it's just all about immunity, and what we all need is a lot more immunity to all the crazy, insane, exploitative, greed-driven, selfish, cheap wins, all that stuff that permeates our lives. at so many points of contact with other people, with the economy, etc. We just have to build this resistance, this immunity to much of what undermines the human spirit in our societies today. So it was only a metaphor. Don't take me too seriously. I just kind of, but that'll teach me. Thank you. Sorry.
No, that was wonderful, Jonathan. And I just want to add one point on the question on women. And I think that is gender equality. I think in a lot of these discussions around climate change and sort of mitigation, adaptation, that women are at the center of it. You see Greta, you see young women. And if you go to any developing country, you find women at the forefront, really, of battling it. And I think the real problem is about not having the opportunities. I think Jonathan put it already very well. They don't have the education, they don't have the healthcare, they don't have the income support, they don't get equal wages, they don't get jobs. That really curtails their confidence and ability to speak out. And I think you articulated it very well, that women feel that they can't speak or they don't have voice to speak out on any of these things, because basically they're pushed out of the public discussion and the public discourse. And I think the only way is collectively actually coming out and addressing it and demanding gender equality and justice.
Well, also on the women point from Francis, I mean, one of the things that I'd say is that I don't think it's fair to say women aren't active on this issue. In fact, from my experience in this industry, there are more women working to save the world than men. Men need to do a bit of stepping up as far as I'm concerned. Thank you. Well, I mean, if you saw my slide where I put, my generation angry, you've got Greta up there, AOC, a bunch of women from Brazil, my friend Clover. There are a lot of great women doing great things in this area. And yes, frankly, considering their disadvantaged status around the world in many places, it's even more credit to them that they're leading the way. And then you had another point about China. And I think this also links in with your overpopulation point. I think it's very easy to point fingers at places around the other side of the world and blame them for the issue that we're in. Overpopulation is an issue that links heavily with poverty. So you're looking at the people at the very bottom of the spectrum. And these people have generally had the least impact on the position that we are in today in terms of on an individual basis. Okay, so we in the privileged developed world have a much higher carbon footprint per capita. The carbon footprint of the average American is 10 or 20 times that of many other people around the world. So we should be leading the way and not offshoring the problem to the people who frankly have had less of an input on getting there. Same with China. China may be the world's biggest polluter now, but if you look at the net cumulative carbon emissions, we not only invented this problem by kicking off the Industrial Revolution, but between us and the US, we have had the biggest carbon footprint cumulatively leading up to date. So we bear the most responsibility for where we are today. We're also the best equipped to respond. We benefited hugely financially from destroying the world for many, many years. It's why we're all so prosperous. It's why we all live so nicely. It's why we're not having loads and loads of kids to support our poor agricultural farms. So we have the money to invest in building a better future, and it's our responsibility to do so. And back onto the cheap wins. On the sort of final point, I agree. It is very hard. It's not just about tax. One of the ways that I think is quite exciting, that's becoming more expensive or more challenging for big companies to do the wrong thing, is that as we as individuals stand up and put our morals before necessarily our own personal profit. So, I mean, arms companies, but also big oil companies and any of the large companies profiting from destroying the planet, finding it harder and harder to hire top talent, intelligent young people, because those young people are deciding that although this planet-destroying company might pay me a lot of money to work there, that's not the type of influence they want to have on the world. So, of course, as individuals, we can also beat this cheap mentality by taking a stand and making it more expensive and more difficult to do the wrong thing.
Thank you. I love it every time he speaks. All of these guys, actually. Just very quickly, before I talk about what it would look like, I just want to see, I don't know whether you can see this, but this is about net zero. And the point that I need to make is that net zero, issues one way or the other, but the most important thing is how we get there. So this curve shows us rapidly decarbonising now and getting there. That's what the IPCC budget for 1.5 is based on, not this, where you've got about 4 or 5 times as much carbon by the time you get to net zero. So, one of the problems with net zero in 2050 is it focuses our attention on 2050, and what we need to be focusing on is the next 5 to 10 years, because otherwise we're going to cross tipping points, which mean that the Earth's going to carry on heating no matter what we do. So that's why it's urgent. In terms of what it would look like if we got to this sustainable society, every decision, every person would be thinking about stuff through that filter of how does this impact the environment, how does it impact my children's future? That it would be, everybody would be on board with this. That would be the fundamental thing. And we would have remembered what we've forgotten, which is that our health is crucially dependent on the natural world. We rely on the natural world for air, for water, for food, for safe temperature. Without it, we fail. And that's what I hope, is that we will get that connection back and to value and be grateful for what we've been given, and to really safeguard this majestic and beautiful planet that we've got. But we need to get there, and the cheap wins thing is really tricky, because we're living with such levels of social inequality now that we cannot blame a lot of people for choosing cheap, because that's what they can afford. And they haven't, when they're working 2 jobs to try and, and their partner's working different shifts, they never see them, so that they can, keep a roof over their kids' heads. They haven't got the bandwidth left to think about these issues. And so that's why addressing social inequality and social injustice has to come hand in hand with this.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a science festival. And what you got was a very interesting insight into how science is changing. It's now about engagement. People talking to each other, sharing ideas, creating new knowledge, not losing the knowledge which is really important. 4 or 5 of the comments made by our speakers today were about how we're in danger of losing knowledge about nutrition, losing knowledge about how to handle mental health, losing knowledge about how to be much more innovative in terms of dealing with waste. These are knowledge questions which you can stamp out if you don't get that recreated in a new form. So the question about Norwich City Council is, in my view, that Norwich City Council now is to be enabling engagement, and that the future City Council is not a top-down governing body, but actually a community-led sharing body. And if the future of all of our governing bodies, whatever scale, global right down to local, took that line of thinking, people would then take the view that what they did and what they contributed to their future would be worth making the effort for. Now, Hayley's last point is the one that I want to touch on. Sustainability is about decency of treatment for everyone. It's about giving everyone a chance to be genuinely human and care for each other and understand that what they're doing is worthwhile for other people as well as for themselves. We are removing those qualities from people. We're giving people, large numbers of them, at least a third in my view, a feeling that they're of no use whatsoever. They are somehow being spat out the side of the system. That's not the way to treat people. That's not the way to treat nature. We have to learn that everyone is our fellow human being and a fellow natural quality that gives us who we are. If in 30 years' time we've got no carbon, but a very unequal society, we have not achieved what we need to achieve. So the question about net zero isn't about net zero, and Hayley's diagrams are absolutely spot on. It's getting there with the time to give ourselves the boundaries and the space to make these changes without being driven to the wall. So the second diagram tells you, and you can see the danger, if we sit around for another 10 years, we will give ourselves no capacity to make these changes. We'll be driven into very dark spaces. And all the things that you've heard this afternoon will be magnified by a factor of 1,000. There's no need for that. The reason why we're meeting here is that we are now at a cusp where these changes have to take place within the next 5 years and ideally starting right now. So I would hope that out of this science festival comes a statement from the City Council, comes a statement from the County Council, starting at least in Norwich. And I'm speaking as president of CPRE Norwich and also of the local councils, which are the parish and town councils. We need to get that mobilizing so that by 2 years from now, the form of governance is a sharing, caring, equalizing process. And we need to have a mechanism that lays that out so that in 2 years' time, we should have another science festival, William, and that science festival should say, how well have we done in the context of what we've just set up for this afternoon? And I think we should do that in September, October 2023. So I'm going to end by saying, first of all, thank you again for coming and for contributing, because you've stirred people up, and I always like to see people stirred up. You certainly stirred me up. I want to thank our panel, some of whom have traveled some distance, some have come here, but they're all dedicated to what they believe in. And you can see that they are representing the kind of change that we want to see. They represent that in their different ways, and I'm not going to spell it out, but each one of those people on the panel is a genuine actor for change. They're not sitting around thinking about things, they're getting things to change, and they've been doing so for many, many years. My nice friend Willem, who sits there quietly doing all the hard work. We swan in, talk a bit, swan out again. This guy does a huge amount to make this happen, and without him this would not have been possible. And to our friends in the Norwich School, who have done a wonderful job in making all of this listenable and visible and hopefully rememberable. So I leave you with two final comments. One is, we have no time to wait. We know that, so don't go home and sit up and say, let's forget about it for another 6 months. We all need to start doing something. And secondly, work with your local authorities, work with your politicians. And if you get some kind of resistance, say to them, this is what I learned from the Norwich Science Festival on Saturday afternoon, and flipping hell, you get on with it like I am, and we'll see where we go. And in 2 years' time with them, run a little accountability exercise so that that blasted curve starts to become concave and not convex from the year zero. Good luck to you all, and keep going.